When you think of slavery in America, you see chains. You see overseers, lashings, cotton fields stretching into the burning sun, and always you see black bodies under white masters. But what if I told you that in the tangled shadows of American slavery, there were stories that break that simple line in two? What if I told you that in Louisiana's cane fields, one of the wealthiest slaveholders wasn't a white planter, but a black man, born free, who owned over 100 slaves? Tonight on Faces of History, we look into a life many would rather forget. Antoine Dubuclet Jr., the richest black man in the South before the Civil War, and yes, a black slaveholder who became Louisiana's state treasurer during Reconstruction. Who was he? Why did he do it? And what does his story say about freedom, power, and the twisted machinery of a country built on bondage? I'm the Duke of New York. Stay curious, stay brave. Let's begin. Picture the banks of the Mississippi River in 1810, a green kingdom of sugarcane, swamp, and cotton fields. The summer sun bakes the muddy roads. The humid air hums with the sound of insects, the slap of paddles along the river's slow brown current, and in the distance the rustle of chains. This is Iberville Parish, Louisiana, where Antoine Dubuclet Jr. first drew breath. He was born free, but freedom in this place was never simple, never safe. The world that surrounded him was built on bondage. The crack of the overseer's whip, the auction block in New Orleans, the wealth of white planters dripping in cane syrup and black sweat. His father, Antoine Dubuclet Sr., was an exception to every rule written to keep black people in their place. A free man of color in a state that barely tolerated such a thing, he was cunning, ambitious, and relentless. He built a plantation when many white men could not. He bought land when others said he had no right. And when the rules said wealth belonged to white hands, Antoine Dubuclet Sr. proved them wrong. He did it the only way the South allowed. He bought people. By the time young Antoine Jr. was old enough to know what those fields were, the Dubuclet name already rested on the deeds to acres of sugarcane and the labor of dozens of enslaved people. In Louisiana, the world of free people of color was its own contradiction. The gens de couleur libres, people of mixed black and white ancestry, carved out a fragile, often dangerous existence. They could not vote. They could not serve on juries. They lived with papers in their pockets, proving freedom, always aware that freedom could vanish if the wrong white man said so. But some of them, men like Antoine's father, built quiet empires. They walked a razor's edge, wealthy enough to win respect, but always vulnerable to suspicion, jealousy, and the threat of new laws meant to push them back down. To protect his family, Antoine Sr. taught his son the language of survival. Keep your books balanced, your enemies close, your white neighbors impressed, and your labor force loyal or at least controlled. Young Antoine learned early that sugarcane did not grow from the ground alone. It grew from black hands under the lash, and the only way to hold power in Louisiana's cane kingdom was to own that labor like everyone else. The makings of a master. The boy was bright. He learned to read, write, keep ledgers, skills most enslaved people were whipped for learning. He spoke French like the Creole aristocrats, knew the right words to charm a banker, the right tone to calm a jealous neighbor. He watched his father borrow, expand, turning swamp into rows of cane so straight they looked like green armies under the sun. He also watched the auction blocks. He knew the numbers beside a man's name, height, age, scars. He knew the smell of sweat in the slave quarters at harvest. He knew what it meant when a woman birthed another child. More hands for the fields, more profit for the family. He was taught to accept it, to see human beings as an asset line, like sugar barrels or mules or the cypress wood that framed the plantation house. This was the contradiction baked into his bones, a black boy born in a white man's system, taught that his freedom was safest when secured by the bondage of others. A legacy passed down. When his father died, Antoine Dubuclet Jr. did not hesitate. He did what his father had trained him to do: expand, secure, and grow the estate. He inherited Belgrove Plantation, one of the largest sugar estates on the west bank of the Mississippi. He inherited the land, the refinery, the debts, and over 100 enslaved souls whose lives and children would be his to command. He married well, Claire Pollard, herself the daughter of free people of color with land and slaves of their own. Their families tied wealth to wealth, sugarcane to sugarcane, a fortress of black privilege perched on a foundation of black bondage. In a land of white supremacy, they built a tiny dynasty insulated by money, cunning, and the brutal math of an economy that said sugar was king no matter who sat on its throne. A boy in a world of chains, grown into a man who holds the keys. As a young man, Dubuclet Jr. did not dream of tearing the system down. He dreamed of surviving it, protecting his own, doubling his inheritance, living so far of the lash that the chains rattling through the fields would never reach his own flesh. In the eyes of the law, he was a free black man. But in the eyes of the enslaved, he was still the master, the same as any white overseer, the same as any plantation baron who counted human lives in bushels of cane. Antoine Dubuclet Jr. was born in a world of chains. He did not break them. He built his fortune on them. And in the chapters ahead, we'll see how that fortune was tested by war, by politics, by freedom itself, when it finally arrived at the gates of Belgrove. By the time Antoine Dubuclet Jr. turned 30, he was no longer just the free black son of a sugar planter. He was the sugar king of Iberville Parish. His name carried weight on every banknote, every trade ledger, every whisper passed in the shaded arcades of New Orleans. The plantation he inherited, Belgrove, sprawled over hundreds of fertile acres. It was prime land, cradled by the Mississippi's rich silt, the black gold of the South. Cane thrived here like nowhere else. It demanded grueling labor and punishing heat, but it yielded a fortune that turned planters into royalty. Antoine Dubuclet Jr. was determined to wear that crown. He didn't gamble or squander the wealth left to him. He expanded it. While other planters fell into ruin with bad debts or reckless speculation, Dubuclet built a sugar machine that ran like clockwork. He invested in the latest processing equipment, iron rollers, steam-powered mills, massive vats for boiling down cane juice into crystal and molasses. He made deals to ship barrels down the Mississippi to New Orleans, then across the Gulf to the world. He employed bookkeepers, overseers, and skilled craftsmen, and he controlled them all with a soft voice, a sharp ledger, and the hard, unblinking discipline of a man who understood what he stood to lose if he failed. The math of flesh. But at the heart of Dubuclet's wealth was not just land. It was people. Over 100 enslaved men, women, and children lived in rows of cabins behind the big house. They cut the cane, fed the rollers, stirred the vats. They were born there, married there, buried there. They were not family. They were property. And Antoine Dubuclet Jr. treated them as such, a necessity for survival in a brutal economy that demanded a steady flow of sweat and blood. On Belgrove, discipline was as strict as any white-run plantation. The overseer's whip did not care about the color of the man who owned the land. To keep the cane flowing, the workforce had to be controlled. Births recorded like foals, runaways tracked like stray cattle. Records show Dubuclet was not a soft master, nor a cruel one by the standards of the day. But to the enslaved, there was little difference. Chains were chains, no matter who held the key. Dubuclet did not build this empire alone. His marriage to Claire Pollard sealed an alliance that doubled his power. Claire's family, also free people of color, owned land and slaves of their own. Their union made them a black dynasty in the very heart of the South's plantation aristocracy. Claire was known for her sharp mind and careful stewardship of their household. She oversaw the domestic sphere while Dubuclet focused on the fields and ledgers. Together, they had 10 children, heirs to a strange legacy. Black children born free in a slave society, raised in luxury, built on the backs of those whose freedom was denied. The Dubuclet family entertained guests with Creole elegance, fine clothes, French wine, carefully chosen company. They were careful never to offend the white planters whose good graces they needed to keep their place secure. They paid their taxes, donated to Catholic charities, and sponsored local improvements, all to prove that they were respectable, refined, and not a threat. But under all the silks and smiles was an unspoken truth. Their security rested on a system designed to dehumanize people who looked just like them. Black planter class always lived under threat. A new law, a jealous neighbor, or a sudden backlash of white rage could strip it all away. And so Antoine Dubuclet Jr. learned to walk the tightrope. He was careful never to side publicly with abolitionists. He said little about politics, spoke nothing about freedom for the enslaved people who made him rich. He invested quietly, made alliances discreetly, paid off debts quickly. If he had opinions about the injustice of slavery, he never wrote them down. To him, wealth was protection, ownership was survival. And survival, in a world where a black man's fortune could vanish with a single piece of paper, meant never challenging the rules of the game. Belgrove produced thousands of barrels of sugar each year, sweet gold that flowed out to feed New Orleans, Europe, and beyond. On the books, Dubuclet's estate was worth well over $200,000, millions in today's dollars. His children lacked for nothing. Tutors, fine clothes, Parisian luxuries. They rode horses through fields where the enslaved cut cane in the same sun. He was the richest black man in Louisiana, maybe in all of the South, yet he remained, in the eyes of the law, a black man, free but not equal, wealthy but not secure, privileged but still balanced on the knife's edge of a society that could turn on him overnight. Antoine Dubuclet Jr. had built his kingdom carefully, stone by stone, barrel by barrel, body by body. But the storm coming would sweep away every illusion that wealth could buy safety, or that a black man could stand above the system that made him rich. War and reckoning. As the Civil War ignites, the sugar empire cracks, the enslaved flee, the cane fields burn, and Antoine Dubuclet Jr. must choose, adapt, resist, or be swept away. This is the part that twists in the gut. It's the part that history teachers skip past, the part that makes easy stories crack like old sugarcane under a millstone. Why did Antoine Dubuclet Jr., a black man in a world built to enslave black people, own other black people? Was he simply a man of his time, a pragmatist, a villain, a victim who became a master, or all of these at once? Inheritance or choice? First, there's the practical answer, the one historians like to start with. Antoine Dubuclet Jr. didn't build Belgrove Plantation from nothing. He inherited it. When his father died, young Dubuclet took over a fully functioning sugar operation, fields, machinery, land, debts, and people. These people, men, women, children, were counted on the same ledgers as barrels of molasses and crates of cane. They were assets, not workers with wages, but property that could be borrowed against, passed to his children, seized by creditors if the sugar failed. So part of the answer is this. Dubuclet did what his father did. He kept the system running because that was the only way to keep the sugar flowing, the debts paid, the family fed. To survive in Louisiana's cutthroat cane economy, you needed land and labor, and the only labor that counted was enslaved. There's more to it than inheritance. Antoine Dubuclet Jr. could have done what some free black people did. Manumit, free their slaves, or hire them as paid laborers. He did not. Why not? Because the brutal truth is that sugar cane was impossible without forced labor, at least at the scale Dubuclet operated. Cane was one of the most demanding crops in the world. It had to be planted, tended, cut, hauled, milled, and boiled under crushing heat and in tight seasonal windows. Machines helped, but the hands that did the cutting and hauling and sweating were black, enslaved, and replaceable. If you freed them, you still needed laborers. And paid labor was rare, unreliable, and expensive. If Dubuclet had freed his workforce, he risked losing his fields, his profits, and his standing overnight. So he did what any other sugar baron did. He calculated profit over principle. A man among many. It's important to say, Dubuclet was not alone. By 1860, there were nearly 4,000 black slaveholders in the American South, mostly in Louisiana and South Carolina, where a unique class of free people of color had managed over generations to buy land, build wealth, and sometimes own slaves themselves. For some, owning enslaved people was a shield. In New Orleans, free black families sometimes bought relatives out of bondage, then technically owned them to protect them from white slave traders. But Dubuclet was not merely protecting kin. He ran Belgrove as a profit engine. His ledgers show no record of mass manumissions. There was no paper trail of secret liberation, only lists of human beings, ages and skills and conditions, just like any white planter's books. Dubuclet himself left no diaries to explain how he saw it. No letters survive to say if he felt guilt or remorse or conflict. All we have are the facts. He ran Belgrove to maximize profit. He kept his workforce enslaved. He expanded his holdings when he could. He married into another wealthy, free black family who did the same. In public, he did not stand with abolitionists. He did not speak against slavery in the courts or pulpits. He did not try to change the system because for him, the system worked. It made him the wealthiest black man in Louisiana, one of the wealthiest men, period. Maybe Dubuclet's story is really about how power corrupts in any hands. Maybe it's about how a man born in a cage will sometimes build his own so long as he can hold the key. Or maybe it's about how the system of slavery was so deeply rooted that even those it was designed to destroy sometimes found ways to bend it for themselves, and in doing so upheld the same machine that crushed others. When the Civil War came, that machine would break apart in fire and iron, and Dubuclet, like every other planter, would have to face a world where labor could not be owned anymore. In the spring of 1861, cannon fire echoed across Charleston Harbor. The Confederacy was born in gunpowder and rebellion, and in the cane fields of Louisiana, planters like Antoine Dubuclet Jr. heard that thunder for what it truly was, a promise that the world was about to change forever. For decades, Dubuclet had thrived in a fragile balance, black, wealthy, powerful, but always operating within the brutal rules of white supremacy. He paid his taxes, nodded politely at white planters, protected his estate by staying silent about abolition. He knew that his freedom and fortune rested on the fact that slavery existed, not only for him, but for every planter in the South. But when Southern states seceded, they did so to protect that very system. And so, ironically, they threatened to destroy the delicate loophole that allowed a black man like Dubuclet to stand above the lash by plunging the entire South into a war it was not prepared to win. For Dubuclet, war was not just about battles in Virginia or blockades in Charleston. War was about his fields, his people, and the future of an economy built on human bondage. Cane fields at risk. At Belle Grove, the canes still needed planting, cutting, boiling, but the world outside the plantation fence was changing fast. Union gunboats patrolled the Mississippi. Federal troops moved downriver. Enslaved people heard the rumors. Freedom was coming, carried on the boots of blue-coated soldiers. The South's planters called it contraband when enslaved people fled to Union lines. But for Dubuclet and men like him, it was worse than contraband. It was the labor force walking away. Across Louisiana, enslaved workers left in the dead of night. Some joined Union regiments as soldiers or laborers. Others hid in swamps or gathered at newly occupied towns under federal protection. Dubuclet's ledgers from these years show the truth. Production fell, debt climbed, barrels of sugar never made it to market. No overseer's whip could hold back the tide of emancipation once the Union Army drew near. Caught between two armies, Louisiana became a battlefield. Union gunboats shelled plantations. Confederate officers requisitioned sugar, horses, wagons, sometimes burning fields so the Yankees wouldn't get them. Planters, white and black, tried to hide their wealth, bribed soldiers, play both sides. Dubuclet did what he always did. He adapted. He negotiated with Confederate officers to protect his crops. He used his connections in New Orleans to secure loans, to buy time, to pay debts. When Union troops moved into Iberville Parish, he switched tactics, cooperating where he could, to protect what little he still controlled. He was not alone in this dance of survival. Many free people of color walked the razor's edge, too black for Confederate loyalty, too invested in the old order to fully embrace the Union. They did what they could to protect their families, their land, their fragile status. In January 1863, President Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation slammed the final nail into the coffin of the world Dubuclet had inherited. It declared that all enslaved people in the rebelling states were free. In practice, freedom didn't come overnight, but its echo carried on every wind. Enslaved people at Belle Grove heard it. They weighed their chances. Some fled to Union camps. Others waited to see if the Confederacy would collapse before they risked everything. For Dubuclet, the math changed overnight. Those people he once counted as assets were no longer his to own, legally at least. Many stayed because they had nowhere to go. Some worked for wages, meager as they were. Others walked off into the night, never to return. By 1865, when the Confederate surrender at Appomattox became a whisper on every southern breeze, the Sugar King of Iberville Parish was king of a kingdom built on quicksand. A fortune in ashes. The war left Belle Grove battered. The machinery rusted, fields went untended, the banks came calling. Dubuclet's debts were large, his workforce gone. Sugar prices yo-yoed wildly as the world adjusted to a new economy. Many white planters lost everything. They fled to Texas or Cuba, or simply vanished into ruin and bitterness. Some of Dubuclet's white neighbors must have looked at him, a black man who once owned over 100 people, and thought, let him fall too. But Antoine Dubuclet Jr. was not ready to vanish. He was a man forged in contradiction, raised to survive. And so, as the South burned, he made the boldest pivot of his life. He would not cling to the past. He would step into a future even more improbable than the last. He would become a politician. When the dust settled, Dubuclet saw what Reconstruction might offer. A new South, a new Louisiana, a new chance for black men, now free citizens, to vote, to hold office, to shape the laws that once crushed them. He knew the books, he knew the ledgers, he knew the game of politics. And in 1868, Louisiana's new biracial state government needed a treasurer, someone who understood the tangled mess of debt, taxes, and rebuilding. So the man who once bought and sold black bodies now took charge of a bankrupt state, trying to figure out what freedom really meant. It is here that the contradictions of Antoine Dubuclet Jr. reach their sharpest point. A black man, once a slaveholder, now elected by freedmen to manage the people's money. When the guns fell silent in 1865, the American South did not simply surrender, it seethed. For Antoine Dubuclet Jr., the fall of the Confederacy opened a door so unlikely it could have been a fever dream. The planter's son, the slaveholder, stepping into the halls of power as an elected black official. But the dream of Reconstruction was built on shifting ground, and beneath it, old hatreds waited to rise again. Antoine Dubuclet Jr. became Louisiana's state treasurer in 1868, just 3 years after the last enslaved people walked free from Belle Grove. Imagine that pivot. A man who once owned over 100 slaves, now working hand in hand with newly freed men who once would have labored under his whip. He was elected not by planters, but by a Republican coalition of freedmen, northern migrants, the so-called carpetbaggers, and local moderates who believed Louisiana could be reborn as something new, a place where black men could vote, build businesses, and govern. Dubuclet, ever the bookkeeper, fit the job well. He balanced accounts, he negotiated debts, he tried to pull Louisiana's battered finances out of the ruins of war. Some saw him as a steady hand, others whispered that a former slaveholder had no right to lead freedmen. But for nearly a decade, Dubuclet stood as living proof of Reconstruction's strange promise, that men once bound by chains could shape the future alongside those who once wielded the chains. Enemies in every corner, Reconstruction brought hope, but it also brought rage. The old planter class, white men who'd lost their fields and fortunes, did not forgive, neither did their children. To them, the sight of a black treasurer managing the state's purse was a daily humiliation. They fought back with new tools, newspapers, rumors, intimidation, and when that failed, outright terror. The Ku Klux Klan rose like smoke in the night, torching black schools and churches, riding down country lanes in hoods and robes to lynch anyone who dared claim equality. Freedmen who tried to vote were beaten. Black officials were threatened. Some were assassinated. Dubuclet himself was not physically attacked. He was too wealthy, too careful, too insulated. But the hatred surrounded him like swamp fog. He faced constant investigations, allegations of corruption, accusations whispered in marble halls and shouted from courthouse steps. Most were lies. Some were half-truths twisted to poison the fragile trust between black voters and their leaders. Still, Dubuclet endured. He balanced Louisiana's debt-riddled books as well as any man could in a state ripped apart by war and corruption. He served under 3 governors, all Republican, all battered by scandals and violence. But Reconstruction was never built to last. The North's will to protect black citizens faded as the years dragged on. Federal troops withdrew. White supremacist groups flourished. The old Confederacy did not die. It adapted, reborn in voter suppression, paramilitary violence, and the ruthless art of redemption. By 1877, with the compromise that ended Reconstruction, the last federal soldiers packed up and left the South to its own devices. Dubuclet, once a symbol of a fragile promise, found himself standing on sand as the tide turned. The cracks widen. His political enemies pounced. Rumors of mishandled funds, accusations of fraud. Committees were formed to investigate him, even though no serious evidence of wrongdoing stuck. To many, it didn't matter. He was black, he was wealthy, and he was in power. That alone made him guilty. As the old order clawed its way back, the new order buckled. One by one, black legislators were voted out or forced out. Parishes that once sent freedmen to Baton Rouge saw new election laws that made black voting almost impossible. Night riders did the rest. In 1878, Antoine Dubuclet Jr. left office. He walked away not in disgrace, but in weariness. He had held the state's purse strings longer than any other official of his time, but the ledger of freedom now showed a cruel balance. The hopes of Reconstruction bankrupt, its debts unpaid. A legacy tangled in contradictions. He returned to Belle Grove, what was left of it. The fields still grew cane, but now paid laborers tilled the rows where once the enslaved bent their backs. His family endured, clinging to status as the state sank deeper into Jim Crow. Dubuclet never became a fiery speaker for civil rights like other black politicians of the age. He was not a man to march or rail against the new wave of white supremacy. He did what he'd always done. He balanced his accounts, guarded his family, survived the storm. When he died in 1887, his obituary noted his unusual place in history. Born free in a world where black freedom was an illusion, enriched by the system that crushed his people, then made a steward of their freedom when that same system fell. He left behind wealth, but also questions that history still wrestles with. Could you be both victim and oppressor? Could you own men and still serve them later? Could one man's careful survival buy freedom for others? Or did it simply prolong the lie that slavery could be anything but monstrous? By the time Antoine Dubuclet Jr. closed his eyes for the last time in 1887, the world that made him and the world he helped make was already slipping away, buried under the thick, choking soil of the Jim Crow South. The last cane fields. In his final years, Dubuclet remained on the land that had defined him, Belle Grove, the sugar fields that once made him the wealthiest black man in the South. The plantation still produced cane, but never again at the fevered pitch of its slave-powered prime. Instead of enslaved laborers bound by chains, there were freedmen bound by debt. Sharecroppers and wage workers locked into a new kind of bondage, one that traded the auction block for the banker's ledger. Belle Grove's books still balanced, but only just. Prices fell, pests devoured crops, hurricanes struck the coast, and each year the plantation slipped closer to the edge. Dubuclet, ever the accountant, kept his ledgers neat. He paid what he could. He owed what he must. He taught his sons how to manage the sugar and his daughters how to manage the household. He held tight to the idea that money could buy safety, even as the world around him proved it could not. A changing South. As the 1880s rolled on, the South remade itself once more, not into the egalitarian promised land of Reconstruction, but into something crueler and more cunning, a world where white supremacy found new tools to bind black freedom. Poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses, all designed to snuff out black political power without a single bullet. Lynchings replaced plantations as the ultimate symbol of white terror. The new generation of Dubuclet's freed laborers learned fast that freedom was a word you whispered, not one you trusted. And yet, even as the promise of Reconstruction collapsed, the Dubuclet family held on, free, educated, wealthy by the standards of their time. They were a living contradiction. The children of a black slaveholder, inheritors of sugar fields once soaked in the sweat and blood of people who looked like them. The final ledger, Dubuclet Jr. died quietly at Belle Grove, surrounded by family. There were no grand speeches, no marble statues planned in his honor. The local papers noted his passing with a few lines about his unusual career, once the richest black planter, then the state treasurer who tried to hold Louisiana's broken finances together. There was no reckoning, no trial in history's court. He left behind his ledgers, neat, precise, full of numbers that did not speak of the human cost beneath them. He left behind fields that would be sold off piece by piece as debts mounted and sugar prices tumbled. He left behind children who would watch the promise of equality close like an iron door, forced to navigate a world where their father's wealth and legacy made them both privileged and suspect. Black yet not simply black, inheritors of a legacy built on contradictions no easy narrative could tidy away. How do we remember him? For a long time, Dubuclet's name faded from popular memory. He was not celebrated like Frederick Douglass or vilified like Jefferson Davis. He didn't fit either side of the easy myth, hero or villain. To some, he was proof that free black people could rise, that the South's rigid racial hierarchies were never as absolute as the textbooks like to pretend. To others, he was a tragic irony, a man who survived by owning people who could have been his kin. In the archives, his papers gather dust beside ledgers listing the names of those he owned, people whose stories we will never know, whose life made his fortune possible, whose freedom outlasted his. What does Antoine Dubuclet Jr. teach us today? That power is not always righteous, that the oppressed can become oppressors. That wealth can blur the lines between freedom and bondage, that human beings, even the ones we wish were simple, are knots of fear, ambition, love, cruelty, and survival instincts too strong to untangle. His story reminds us that history is not always a clean ledger. Sometimes it's a page smeared with sugar and blood, balanced for a time, but always owing something deeper than money could ever repay. When you stand on the old sugar fields of Iberville Parish today, there's little left of Belle Grove. The river bends the same way. The cane still grows in rows when the season's right, but the big house is gone, the cabin's gone, the overseer's whip silent. All that's left is the land and the ghosts. And a name, Antoine Dubuclet Jr., that lives in parish records, dusty history books, and the uneasy question he leaves behind. What do we do with a freedom built on chains? Tonight, you've walked the cane rows, you've seen the ledgers, you've felt the contradictions that history tries so hard to bury. If you learned something tonight, share it, talk about it, question it. I'm the Duke of New York. Stay curious, stay brave, and remember, the past is never just the past. Sometimes it's the plantain you still stand on. Sometimes it's the sugar in your coffee.